episode of Chordplay, and this is the Chords of Pearl Jam. And Pearl Jam formed in Seattle, Washington in 1990 and went on to become one of the most popular alternative rock bands of the 90s. And I definitely remember when they hit the scene because there was this noticeable shift from a lot of the 80s, hard rock and hair metal or whatever. And then suddenly you had bands like Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, and of course Nirvana that hit the scene. And I remember noticing it on MTV first, and then it started to pop up, in magazines. It started to pop up everywhere. And the next thing I knew, grunge music had just basically taken over and dominated, the American rock music market. And even though I was still digging around for a lot of, shred and, Dream Theater and Steve Vai, I definitely got into bands like Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, definitely a big Tool fan. And there's some great music in the 90s. You just have to kind of sift through some of the alternative kind of fluff to find the really good stuff. And definitely Pearl Jam is some of the good stuff. The big thing I remember is Alice in Chains, when I heard Man in the Box and some of their early, output, there were guitar solos. Pearl Jam 10, there were guitar solos. There was this kind of Hendrix influence. Wah pedal, single coil, pickups. You could hear this biting kind of 60s and 70s sound in the 90s rock music. And of course you have to think 90s music, there was a big push and nostalgic push for 70s music. Black Sabbath had a huge comeback. Neil Young was named the godfather of grunge. Neil Young had a huge comeback. And there was all this, Hendrix respect, Led Zeppelin respect. So I do remember, like suddenly it went from the 80s to the 90s, but there was all this 70s outpour, like the movie Dazed and Confused. There's a whole bunch of 70s kind of nostalgia and influence in the 90s. And I think that's why I locked onto it. Because when I heard Alice in Chains and Pearl Jam and some of these bands, I could hear this new, edge. But I could also hear Zeppelin and the Beatles and, the Who and all these different things hiding in their music, which I just dove into it. Pearl Jam has an interesting history. If you're, looking for some things to kind of research or read about, check out Pearl Jam because it really is kind of the formation of the band Mother Love Bone and Temple of the Dog. And when those two entities kind of came together, eventually, you had the bands Pearl Jam and also Soundgarden that kind of spawned from those two groups, Mother Love Bone and Temple of the Dog. And we are going to look at a Temple of the Dog, song in this lesson. But it is kind of interesting to notice those early years. I think they were actually called Mookie Blaylock, after the basketball player. And they had this kind of, transitional early days. And then eventually they became Pearl Jam. With the opening, that was Yellow Ledbetter, which was actually the B-side to the Jeremy single. And then it was also included in the Rearview Mirror Greatest Hits package. But there's a definite, Hendrix influence. It sounds like a kind of a crossbreed between Little Wing and Castles Made of Sand. And you have, Yellow Ledbetter, like this. Right there, we're basically playing a three-chord progression. It's E, B, and A, and then eventually moves back to E again. But we're not doing it like that. We're doing this kind of syrupy, Hendrixy, kind of Motown R&B kind of thing. So right there, you're just basically moving into that G sharp, and then playing that E over G sharp right there. And then you kind of come down like that kind of hammer on pull off fill, very Hendrixy. And then there you're basically grabbing B, but you're also using your thumb right there for the root note, and you're also grabbing the ninth up there, that C sharp. And then you're going to go down to A, and you're basically starting, with this A9, lift off that B note and go back to A. And he's kind of playing with the sus4. He's also adding, that B and that F sharp on the top. And then there's like a little fill in there. And then you basically cycle through all that again. And it's just slightly different the second time through. You know, start with that B and the B9, the A9 to A. And then that last little fill, he's basically, you know, doing a double stop there on the 12th fret, slides up to 19, and then grabs 19 on the low E and slides off. And then the verse, you know, kind of starts right there. You know, a timeless guitar part, very Hendrix, you know, influenced. And I've always liked that guitar part. Next up is the intro to Say Hello to Heaven, and this is from the Temple of the Dog album, and it has this kind of tremolo, you know, shaky beginning, and then just, you know, 3, you know, bar chords, but the progression, you know, creates this really dark and ominous sound, like this. Like that. And I'm actually using the MXR Phase 95 for the tremolo effect. I don't really have a tremolo pedal. So that's close to the effect. You hear that kind of underwater, you know, kind of tremolo sound. So during this guitar part, there's a lot of implied and partial chords like this. You just think of that as like G over F and then E minor 7 if you want to think of the actual chords there. And then you're grabbing this. So you can think of that as like a B flat 6 sharp 11, and then this, it's A7 sus 4 basically. So there are chords happening there. And then you're moving to the C sus 2, and you're moving to this. So you can think of that as a B minor 11 flat 6. And then right there, you're literally grabbing that F with the open G and open high E. That's an F sharp major, F sharp major 7 sus 2. And then move to this. It's like an E minor 7. And then you have this series of, you know, bar chords. And it's basically F to A flat to G. Alternative and grunge music, you'll find a lot of just kind of major and minor bar chords, but performed using these kind of non-diatonic progressions where they twist these chord progressions and basically use chords in combinations you normally wouldn't use, but it's attention getting, you know, it grabs your attention. You know, when you hear that progression, you know it's not quite normal, but it still sounds good. Next example, this is the outro of Jeremy, and I've always found this, you know, kind of sequence of arpeggiated chords really interesting. Something like this. Something like that. And we're basically playing with all these different versions of A and A7. There's some sus4 and a lot of implied chords and partial chords. So we're starting with this, and you're really just playing A7 sus4 to an A6 sus2. And right there, you're basically moving to that partial A minor chord right there. It's interesting because that open A string is really prominent. You know, it's almost kind of pushing or driving the rhythm of that guitar part. And then the second time through, you're doing this. At the end, it basically ends with that harmonic, and you're basically grabbing the 7th fret on the D and the 5th fret on the G, almost like a cherry on top of that guitar part. But I like that guitar part. It has this, you know, kind of dreamy sound. Up next is the song Given to Fly from the Yield album, and this is in Dadgad tuning. So we have D, A, D, G, A, D, or Dadgad. And the guitar part itself is this kind of quirky, you know, kind of using partial chords with open strings, and it's finger picked. And it is unusual, but I like this guitar part like this. Right there, we're basically starting with this. And that's really weird because we're starting with that open A string and then hammering onto that G note. So that's going to function as G, basically. And right there, you're basically sliding into the 9th fret there on the A and the B, and that's an implied G major 7. That's basically like a G6 to a G5. So there's a whole bunch of G, you know, implied chords here. And then right there, it's kind of like a D sus2 to D major. Especially with the tuning too, but such a unique guitar part. I like it. Up next is Better Man from the Vitology album, and he's kind of finger picking, and there are all these flat 6 chords all over the place. Something like this. Starts with this. So you're basically grabbing this, and you can kind of think of that as like a D over F sharp. But then occasionally you're going to hear, you know, that 6th kind of thrown in there too. flat 6. Right there you've got A minor flat 6, and then that's going to move up to this B, and that's a B minor 11 flat 6. But I'm a big fan of those types of chords where we're just moving, one fingering, with the open strings kind of chiming in a little bit too, and that opens up this really kind of transparent guitar, chord progression. But the guitar part, really does kind of create that mood or that sound. It's very simple. But, like I've mentioned on numerous Chordplay episodes, that just grabs your attention, when you hear that link between the chords. Very memorable and great guitar part for sure. Okay, the last example is from the song Black, and this is also from the 10 album, and I've had a lot of students over the years request this song or ask for it, and you can use a pick if you want to, but the intro, it's so quiet and it doesn't really have a prominent pick sound like against the strings, and I've just kind of ended up using my fingers over the years and just quietly strum it with the tips of my fingers like this. Starts. So it's really quiet, and like I said, I'm just kind of brushing my fingertips against the strings. But you can see we're basically grabbing this E7 right there. And then occasionally, like when they do the transition between the chords, you're lifting up this G sharp, which is going back to that F sharp right there. So it's kind of like a E7 sus2, I guess. And then you're moving to this. And that is basically A sus2 the first time right there. And then go back to that E7. Right there you're going to that A, and you're actually making A major happen that first time. And then back to E7. And then right there just go to a full A major bar chord. And back to that E7. And then you kind of wait for that bass riff before the verse starts. But that's a classic song. And the guitar part's very simple. But I like that very delicate, kind of quiet, almost reminds me of Pink Floyd or somebody. Really quiet. Going to wrap this episode of Chordplay with the Chords of Pearl Jam, and I'm definitely a fan. I think Mike McCready is a really interesting guitarist, and Stone Gossard, the rhythm guitarist. But McCready has this Hendrix thing, and I'm a fan of anybody that loves Hendrix because I'm a huge Hendrix fan. But as soon as I noticed his, guitar playing, I heard some of the wah activity and some of the rhythm work and stuff, I thought, man, this guy's a huge Hendrix fan, and he is. And I think that kind of transcends into why I kind of latched onto their music, and I just accepted them right along with, Alice in Chains and Soundgarden and Tool and the rest of the groups I mentioned earlier. And, Stone Temple Pilots was great. There's a lot of great music in the 90s. It's just, I've met a lot of people, and some people love it and they embrace it. Some people don't like it and they run screaming, the opposite direction. And for me, I think it was more, just the time period and my age. I grew up listening to tons of 80s rock, 70s and 80s, rock and hair metal. And then by the time the 90s really hit and the alternative revolution really hit, I mean, I was still into 80s rock, but I think I was almost ready for something different, and I noticed all these different chords and different tunings and tones, feedback and noise and all this stuff that wasn't really around in the 80s, where it was more kind of detailed and very, locked in and very tight and very clean. Whereas the 90s were kind of fuzzier and dirtier and kind of raw, and it was kind of a shock to my system where it's like, oh wow, this guy is not playing anything like Steve Vai or Malmsteen. He's playing something else. And I got into it. It may not be my all time favorite style of music or decade of music, but there's some great music in the 90s for sure. And Pearl Jam was a big part of that. So, anyway, leave some feedback and some comments. Please subscribe to Late Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know it with more content and material. Thank you.